Hello. Today we're going to talk about vector and raster images. These are two ways that images are saved through various design programs. Ultimately, it also impacts on how it's going to how it appears on certain documents. The image on the left is what's known as a vector image, and the image on the right is a raster image. You can see that there's one that's more clear than the other, and then also what you might notice that there's a background difference between this image and this image. Ultimately, there's a sense of quality that kind of comes through that when you see these things. Vector images will have a smoother, rounder edge. There's still pixels there that makes up the entire image, but the thing about raster images, the pixels are much more noticeable most of the time, especially when you enlarge them beyond their original size. Here's what fonts look like when you use a vector image or a bitmap. Because the thing about bitmap is that if you imagine that all these everything that you see here is just a bunch of little squares, the squares have to have information. And that also includes anything that's white, because you see that it's white, that actually it has a color block of just white, all the 255 components of color for red, green, and blue filling up that little square. But with a vector image, the unique thing about it is that it's really like akin to when we were working in Adobe Illustrator. It's this general shape, and then whatever is filled in between the shape is actual what you see, but the background is actually transparent in many ways. So there's again a quality difference between the two, and a specific place when you use them. And vector images again are mathematical equations using the x and y coordinates on a grid, and then you put a dot on the grid and you put another dot on the grid and you connect the dots in the form of shape. The good thing about the good use of a vector image is that it can be resized into anything that's a quarter inch all the way up to 2 feet and beyond without losing any quality. Partly because it's a mathematical equation that makes up the image. So it's easier to manipulate and scale, particularly like logos or logo marks or logo type, if they're in a vector format, such as a EPS file. So InDesign or Illustrator is what we use to create our vector images, or InDesign too. So either one, Illustrator or InDesign, can create a vector image from the work file, but EPS is the common way that we save vector images. And EPS, again, they're a relatively small file size. They don't have a background unless you put a background into it. So it can be transparent, and then again, it can be scaled. It's primarily used for print medium, offset printing or commercial printing, either one, and it's a way of being able to ensure the quality of an image. And the other vector image is a PDF that you see. Oftentimes we don't scale PDFs up and down, but it does keep the quality. And it's very noticeable when you print it. When you print a vector image, you see the quality difference as opposed to when you see a raster image printed. Raster images basically is a grid map of bits, small little bits, and they comprise what we call pixels. But ultimately, the raster images are a fixed size. So if you're working with a image that's 8 by 10, the image at its maximum capacity would be 8 by 10. And if you enlarge an image to say, I want it to be like 16 by 20, which is 4 times bigger than the original file size, you will start noticing the edges become very soft and fuzzy, and that's because the pixels are being stretched over the area to actually cover the area, as opposed to a vector image, which is a mathematical calculation that will recalculate the size difference and then reallocate the pixels in order to display it properly. Raster images often have a lot more detail, and their raster images are very useful for photographs. But with all that details in the pixels, you will ultimately see that your file size is relatively large because it needs to have, the larger file size because every single pixel in the image is being used. Common file types include JPEG. This is why if you download a JPEG for a project and you use it in your document and you enlarge it, and it looks a little fuzzy. It's because it's a raster image. It's not supposed to go that big, bigger than the original file size. Of course, the GIFs and the PNGs that we're familiar with, those are very common raster images. They're a little bit on the lower quality side compared to a JPEG. So I don't use them. They're not really used that often, but they're very accessible. But these three here, JPEG, the GIFs, and the PNGs, are what you find used on the internet quite, almost every day, because of the relatively small file size, and then we have the TIFF, which is a high resolution raster image, and TIFF images are the best to use for photographic quality prints. I want to talk about files and then the file order, I guess, in Photoshop. Basically, we always start when we're working in a Photoshop. That's pretty much our work file. The key thing about Photoshop and TIFF documents, they both can be work file or final files, so they can be sent to a printer to have a nice high quality print made. The difference between the PSDs and the TIFFs lies in the fact that they can both have layers, which is a non-destructive way of editing your images. And then with the JPEGs and the GIFs and the PNGs, they're usually known as the final files. We usually do all of our work on a work file and then make a JPEG for use on the web or whatever project we're working on that requires a lower quality or web standard. They don't have layers. It flattens everything. It takes all the work layers out. So again, that makes it pretty much finalized. And then they have a lower quality, so they're not really suitable for printing on a photographic quality print. We talk about Illustrator files. We always start with the Illustrator work document. That's our work file. And then when we're finished with the project, we can export it in multiple different ways. If you're working with an illustration and you wanted to have it for print, EPS is the primary file format for anything that's high quality that you're looking for. But again, it takes away all the layers. As opposed to Illustrator, you can work in layers all day long. But then it's non-editable, so that means nobody can change your logo if ever need be. It also has a transparency feature, so that way if you want the logo to sit on top of a color background one day and then put it on a different color background another day, that's where the transparency comes into play. But the key thing, it's infinitely scalable and it's high quality. So logos for big companies can be scaled down to 1/4 inch for a printed document, or to as big as 10 feet if need be. And then there's the other ways of looking at it. The PDF document. PDFs are a great way to send files back and forth for clients to look at or for people to look at. It's a very common format. EPS is only used for the process of for a printed document or to be placed inside of a document for printing later. But a PDF is something that everybody can actually look at. Again, it's no layers, non-editable, but it's still high quality. And then you have the JPEG, GIFs, and the PNGs. Again, low quality, small file size, web standard. So you can take an image from Illustrator, InDesign, and go different ways depending on what your needs are in the end. And lastly, for those of you working in InDesign, InDesign is a merger of text and images. So you're constantly going to bring in stuff into InDesign, and when you're working in InDesign, I always recommend work with the high quality stuff first. So getting high quality raster images and high quality EPS files And then you can always, at the end, export that document into a PDF again, which is very useful for sending to multiple folks to be able to read and just look at, or for some printing. And then, from an InDesign document, you can actually export as JPEG, GIFs, and PNGs again. Again, they have no layers, non-editable, and then they'll be smaller file sizes, so it's faster to transmit on the internet. And then lastly, I put on here data size. Data size, we work in an industry where we use a lot of data, um, and just have an understanding of how much data that we consume. Right now, a lot of our Photoshop documents can be hundreds of megabytes, and then if you add up 100, a couple, 2, 20, 30 images, that can start eating up gigabytes of your hard drive. So just having an understanding of file sizes, and basically everything in file sizes really operate on the metric system, so it's multiple by tens all the time, from kilobytes to megabytes to gigabytes. This is 1 gigabyte will equal 1 billion bits of information or bytes of information, as opposed to a megabyte, which is 1 million bytes of information. So having that understanding of like file size is beneficial when you're working with raster images, because they will take up lots of information at one time, as opposed to a vector file. They're a little bit smaller, and a lot more manageable. But if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and thank you.